They called her Moses. But before she led 300 souls to freedom, before she became the Union's most feared spy, she was just a woman staring at the North Star through a crack in a wooden slave cabin. You think you know courage? You think you understand what it means to risk everything? Let me tell you about the night Harriet Tubman decided that freedom was worth more than life itself. Picture this: Maryland, 1849. A woman barely 5 feet tall, suffering from seizures that could strike at any moment, makes a decision that would terrify the bravest soldier. She's going to run. Not just run. She's going to walk straight into the mouth of hell and come back, again and again and again. The plantation dogs are howling in the distance. Every shadow could be a patroller. Every snapping twig could mean capture, torture, death. But Harriet Tubman doesn't flinch. You know why? Because she's already dead. The moment she decided to be free, she killed the slave they wanted her to be. I had reasoned this out in my mind, she would later say. There was one of two things. I had a right to liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other. These aren't just words. This is a battle cry that would echo through the Civil War and shake the very foundations of the Confederacy. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. Before she became a spy, before she led raids, before she became a legend, she was terrified, just like you would be, just like anyone would be. The difference? She moved anyway. You see that scar on her forehead? That's where an overseer threw a 2-pound weight at her when she was just 13, trying to stop him from beating another slave. That injury gave her visions, seizures that would plague her for life. The doctor said it would kill her. The masters said it made her worthless. But what if I told you that injury became her greatest weapon? When the visions came, she saw things others couldn't. Routes through swamps, safe houses glowing like beacons, danger before it arrived. Some called it brain damage. She called it God speaking directly to her. And when God speaks, Moses listens. The night she escaped, she didn't just run north. She ran toward a destiny that would see her become the only woman to lead men into combat during the Civil War. She ran toward a future where she would sit in strategy meetings with generals, where she would infiltrate Confederate camps, where she would free more slaves in one night than most abolitionists freed in a lifetime. But first, she had to survive that first terrible night of freedom. The Underground Railroad wasn't a railroad, and it wasn't underground. It was a network of secrets, lies, and unimaginable courage. And Harriet Tubman was about to become its most dangerous conductor. You think you understand risk? Stand. Try leading 19 trips back into slave territory when there's a $40,000 bounty on your head. That's over $1 million today. Try doing it when one wrong move means not just your death, but the death of every soul you're trying to save. Here's what freedom looked like in 1850. A constitutional obligation to return escaped slaves. Federal marshals authorized to deputize any citizen to help capture runaways. A nation where your very existence was illegal in half the country. This is the America that Harriet Tubman decided to defy. Not with words, not with protests, but with actions that would make Navy SEALs look cautious. She developed a system. Saturday night escapes because newspapers wouldn't print runaway notices until Monday. Winter journeys, when the nights were long and the darkness was her ally. A pistol at her hip, not for the slave catchers, but for the slaves who wanted to turn back. You'll be free or die, she'd tell them. Because one person's fear could kill them all. But the Civil War changed everything. Suddenly, this conductor became something else entirely. In 1861, Union forces captured the Sea Islands off South Carolina. They needed someone who could move through Confederate territory like a ghost, someone who could gather intelligence from slaves who trusted no white face, someone who had spent a decade perfecting the art of invisibility. They needed Harriet Tubman. Governor Andrew of Massachusetts knew exactly who to call, but when he offered her a position as a spy for the Union Army, do you know what she said? She negotiated. This former slave, this woman who couldn't read or write, looked a governor in the eye and demanded proper support for her operations. She got it. The transformation was remarkable. The woman who had once hidden in swamps and barns was now hiding in plain sight. She became a nurse, a cook, a washerwoman, any role that would let her move freely through Confederate territory. To the rebels, she was invisible, just another colored woman doing menial work. They never suspected that their battle plans, their troop movements, their supply lines were all being memorized by a mind sharper than any general's. She recruited a network of former slaves as scouts and spies. These men and women, dismissed by Confederate officers as ignorant property, became the Union's most valuable intelligence assets. They mapped rivers, counted soldiers, identified supply depots, and every piece of information flowed through Harriet Tubman back to Union command. The Confederates never saw her coming. How could they? Their entire worldview was built on the belief that people like Harriet Tubman were inferior, incapable of strategy or cunning. That blindness would cost them dearly. Because while they were watching for Union cavalry, a 5-foot-tall woman was dismantling their defenses from the inside out. Think about the audacity of it. A woman who had been property, who had been beaten and sold and treated as less than human, was now holding the fate of Confederate operations in her hands. Every time she smiled and nodded at a rebel officer, every time she served a meal while listening to their careless talk, she was gathering the intelligence that would bring their world crashing down. June 2, 1863, the Combahee River, South Carolina. What happened that night would go down in history as one of the most daring raids of the Civil War. But here's what the history books often miss. It was planned and led by a woman who couldn't read a map. She navigated by instinct, by intelligence, gathered from slaves, by a knowledge of the land that came from years of midnight escapes. Harriet Tubman was about to prove that formal education had nothing on hard-won wisdom. Colonel James Montgomery had the boats and the soldiers, but he needed someone who could guide them through Confederate territory in complete darkness, someone who could convince hundreds of slaves to risk everything on a promise of freedom. He needed someone the slaves would trust instantly. When Harriet Tubman stepped onto that gunboat, she wasn't just a guide. She was Moses, come to part the waters of bondage. The plan was audacious. Steam up the Combahee River under cover of darkness, destroy Confederate supply lines, burn the plantations that fed the rebel army, and most importantly, liberate every slave they could find. The Confederate forces had torpedoes, underwater mines, protecting the river. One wrong move and the entire operation would end in disaster. But Tubman's network had done their work. They knew exactly where those torpedoes were placed. As the gunboats moved through the darkness, Tubman stood at the bow like a figure from prophecy. When they reached the first plantation, chaos erupted. Slaves had been told by their masters that the Yankees would sell them to Cuba, that freedom was worse than slavery. They hid in terror until they heard her voice, until they saw her face, until Moses called them home. Come along, she shouted. Uncle Sam is rich enough to give you all a farm. But when fear still held them back, she did something remarkable. She began to sing, not just any song, the coded spirituals of the Underground Railroad. The songs that meant safety, that meant trust, that meant the promise was real. And they came. First in ones and twos, then in families, then in floods. The overseers tried to stop them. They threatened, they whipped, they shot into the crowds. But you can't stop a river once the dam breaks. You can't hold back freedom once people taste. 756 slaves ran to those boats that night. Men carrying children, women carrying everything they owned, elderly folks who had waited their entire lives for this moment. As plantations burned behind them, lighting up the night sky like beacons of justice, Confederate forces scrambled to respond. But how do you fight an enemy who knows your every move? How do you stop a force led by someone who had spent years learning to be invisible? The rebels fired from the shores, but the boats were already gone, carrying their human cargo to freedom. Colonel Montgomery would later report to his superiors about the raid's success. But in his official report, he made something crystal clear. This victory belonged to Harriet Tubman. She seems to have a special angel to guard her, he wrote. But it wasn't an angel. It was intelligence, courage, and the kind of tactical brilliance that they never expected from a former slave. Think about what this means. In a war where generals became legends for their strategies, where West Point graduates were celebrated for their tactical genius, it was an illiterate woman who pulled off one of the most successful raids of the entire conflict. She freed more slaves in one night than most military operations freed in months. And she did it without losing a single soul under her command. The morning after the Combahee raid, something unprecedented happened. 756 people woke up free for the first time in their lives. But freedom in the middle of a war zone isn't simple. You can't just declare someone free and expect them to know what to do with it. This is where Harriet Tubman's true genius revealed itself. She wasn't just a liberator, she was a builder of new lives. The Union Army didn't know what to do with hundreds of refugees, but Tubman did. She had been preparing for this moment her entire life. She organized them into work groups. The able-bodied men who wanted to fight were recruited into the Union Army, the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, one of the first official black regiments. The women and children were taught skills that would help them survive in freedom. And through it all, Tubman was there, the bridge between two worlds. But the Confederacy was learning. After Combahee, they knew they had a serious problem. This wasn't just about escaped slaves anymore. This was about military intelligence, strategic warfare, and systematic dismantling of their economic base. Orders went out. Find the woman they called Moses. Stop her by any means necessary. The bounty on her head skyrocketed. She had become one of the most wanted figures in the Confederacy. Did this stop her? If you think yes, you haven't been paying attention. Harriet Tubman doubled down. She expanded her spy network, recruiting more agents from the constant flow of escaped slaves. She taught them her methods: how to remember without writing, how to count troops without seeming to look, how to be invisible in plain sight. The Confederacy was now facing an intelligence network made up of the very people they had trained to be invisible. She worked directly with General David Hunter, commander of the Department of the South. This former slave was now sitting in strategy meetings with Union generals, pointing out Confederate weaknesses, suggesting raid targets, providing intelligence that shaped military operations. When General Hunter needed to know Confederate troop strength at Charleston, Tubman's network provided the numbers. When he needed to know about supply lines, her spies mapped them out. But here's what's remarkable. She did all this while suffering from temporal lobe epilepsy caused by that childhood head injury. The seizures could strike at any moment. She would collapse unconscious, sometimes for hours. Imagine conducting spy operations, leading raids, managing networks, all while knowing that at any moment your body could betray you. Yet she persisted. The visions that came with her seizures, she claimed, showed her things others couldn't see. Dangers to avoid, paths to take. Whether divine intervention or neurological phenomenon, it worked. The Confederate response grew desperate. They tried counterintelligence, feeding false information to suspected spies. But Tubman's network was too smart, too careful. They had learned from the master of caution herself. They tried infiltrating her organization with double agents. But you can't fake the shared experience of bondage. Her people could smell a Confederate spy before they opened their mouth. By 1864, Harriet Tubman had become something unprecedented in American military history. A black woman whose intelligence operations were shaping the course of the war. She wasn't just freeing slaves anymore. She was helping to destroy the entire system that had enslaved them. Every raid guided by her intelligence, every Confederate supply line disrupted by her information, every rebel plan foiled by her network. It all added up to a systematic dismantling of the Confederacy's ability to wage war. And still, she remained invisible to history being written by the men around her. While generals wrote memoirs and officers received commendations, Tubman continued her work in the shadows, because that's where she was most effective. That's where Moses had always done her best work. Charleston, 1865. The war was ending, but Harriet Tubman's most dangerous mission was just beginning. The Confederate capital of resistance was crumbling, and she was there, in the heart of it, gathering intelligence that would help ensure the rebellion's final defeat. But this time, she wasn't just spying on troop movements. She was documenting something else: the complete collapse of a civilization built on human bondage. You have to understand what Charleston meant to the Confederacy. This was where the first shots of the war were fired. This was the symbolic heart of the rebellion, the city that had chosen war rather than give up slavery. And now, as Union forces closed in, it was a powder keg of desperate Confederate soldiers, terrified white civilians, and thousands of slaves who sensed freedom approaching like a storm. Tubman moved through the city like smoke. To the panicking Confederates, she was just another servant, invisible in their fear and rage. But she was watching everything: the hasty destruction of documents that might implicate rebel leaders, the hidden caches of weapons that die-hard Confederates planned to use for guerrilla warfare, the networks of resistance that were already forming to fight Reconstruction. All of it went into her mental files, reported back to Union intelligence. But something else was happening in those final days. The slaves of Charleston were waking up, not just to freedom, but to the possibility of justice. And they came to Moses with their stories. They told her about the mass graves, the torture chambers, the separated families. They gave her names, dates, evidence of atrocities that the Confederacy was desperately trying to hide. Harriet Tubman was becoming not just a spy, but a witness to history's greatest crime. When Charleston finally fell in February 1865, Tubman was among the first to enter the abandoned slave markets. Can you imagine that moment? Standing in the place where human beings had been bought and sold like cattle, where families had been torn apart, where she herself could have ended up if fate had been different. But she wasn't there for sentiment. She was there for intelligence, because she knew something that many Union officers didn't yet understand. The war might be ending, but the battle for freedom was just beginning. The intelligence she gathered in Charleston would prove crucial in the coming years. The names of Confederate officers who were planning to continue the fight through terrorism. The locations of hidden weapons that would later be used by the Ku Klux Klan. The identities of slaves who had been forced to work on Confederate fortifications and knew where everything was hidden. This information would help the Union Army maintain order during the chaotic early days of Reconstruction. But Tubman discovered something else in Charleston, something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Among the Confederate documents being burned, her network found records of a special unit that had been tasked with hunting her down. The resources they had devoted to catching one woman were staggering. The methods they had authorized were horrifying. They hadn't just wanted to capture her. They had wanted to make an example of her that would terrify every slave who dreamed of freedom. Reading those documents, or rather having them read to her, Tubman realized the full magnitude of what she had accomplished. She had been David against Goliath, and she had won. Not through strength, but through intelligence, courage, and an unshakable faith in the justice of her cause. The Confederacy had thrown everything they had at her, and she had not only survived, but thrived. As she stood in the ruins of Charleston's slave market, surrounded by the chains and shackles of bondage, Harriet Tubman did something remarkable. She gathered the formerly enslaved people around her and told them the truth. Freedom wasn't going to be easy. The papers might say they were free, but there would be those who would try to put new chains on them. They would need to be vigilant, organized, ready to fight for their rights with ballots instead of bullets. Moses had led them out of Egypt, but the Promised Land would require its own battles. The spy who had outwitted the Confederacy was already planning for the next war, the war for the soul of America that would continue long after the guns fell silent. The war was over, but for Harriet Tubman, a new battle was beginning, one that would prove even more challenging than outwitting Confederate forces. You see, when the guns fell silent and the generals went home to write their memoirs, Moses found herself facing an enemy she couldn't defeat with courage alone: bureaucracy and indifference. Here's a truth that might make you angry. It should make you angry. The woman who had risked her life countless times for the Union, who had led raids and rescued hundreds, who had provided intelligence that helped win the war, was denied her military pension. For 30 years, She fought for recognition of her service. 30 years. Think about that. She could outwit Confederate generals, but she couldn't navigate the paperwork of a grateful nation. The government that had been eager to use her skills when they needed them suddenly developed amnesia. When it came time to pay her, officials questioned whether her service counted since she was a woman. They questioned whether her intelligence work was official, since much of it was undocumented for security reasons. They questioned everything except the results she had delivered when the Union needed them most. But Harriet Tubman didn't know how to quit. Never had, never would. While fighting for her pension, she was also fighting a different kind of war. In Auburn, New York, she established a home for elderly and indigent African Americans. Using her own meager resources, money she had saved, from selling pies and root beer to soldiers during the war, she created a sanctuary for those freedom had left behind. You want to know what real strength looks like? Picture this. A woman in her 60s suffering from seizures and the accumulated injuries of a lifetime of struggle, taking in elderly former slaves who had nowhere else to go. She fed them from her own garden. She nursed them through their final illnesses. She gave them something the nation seemed determined to deny: dignity and respect. The irony was breathtaking. Confederate generals who had fought to preserve slavery were having monuments erected in their honor. They were writing books, giving lectures, being celebrated as noble warriors of a lost cause. Meanwhile, the woman who had done more than almost anyone to destroy that cause was struggling to pay for food and medicine for the people she sheltered. But here's where the story takes a turn that should give you hope. The next generation hadn't forgotten Moses. Young African Americans who had grown up hearing stories of the woman who led slaves to freedom began to organize. They petitioned Congress. They collected testimonies from soldiers who had served with her. They refused to let America forget what Harriet Tubman had done. Sarah Bradford, a white woman who had befriended Tubman, published her biography in 1869. For the first time, the full scope of Tubman's contributions was laid out for the public. The raids, the rescues, the intelligence operations, all of it documented while witnesses were still alive to verify the truth. The book sold well, providing Tubman with some much-needed income. But more importantly, it began to cement her place in history. Still, the pension was denied. Year after year, the applications were rejected on technicalities. The same government that had trusted her intelligence when Confederate armies were bearing down on them now questioned whether she had really served at all. It wasn't until 1899, 34 years after the war ended, that she finally received a pension. $8 a month. For comparison, white nurses who had served received $12. Even in victory, there was inequality. But if you think this discouraged her, you haven't learned anything about Harriet Tubman. She took that $8 and stretched it to continue funding her home for the elderly. She spoke at suffrage meetings, linking the fight for women's rights to the fight for racial justice. She understood what many didn't. Freedom was not an event but a process, and that process was far from over. A church in Auburn, New York. Harriet Tubman stands before a mixed congregation, black and white, former slaves and former abolitionists, veterans and civilians. She's been asked to speak about her experiences. What comes out of her mouth that day will reshape how Americans understand courage, faith, and resistance. Because Moses isn't just telling war stories, she's delivering prophecy. I was conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, she begins, her voice carrying the authority of someone who has looked death in the face and laughed. And I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track and I never lost a passenger. The crowd erupts. But she's not done. She has lessons to teach, and she knows her time to teach them is limited. She tells them about the raids, yes, about the spy networks and the midnight escapes. But more than that, she tells them about fear, how it feels to hear bloodhounds in the distance, how it feels to know that one wrong step means not just your death, but the death of everyone trusting you. And then she tells them the secret. I wasn't afraid because I couldn't die but once. Think about the profound simplicity of that statement. In an era when America was trying to rebuild itself, when former slaves were trying to understand what Freedom meant when the entire nation was grappling with its identity, here was a woman saying, "Master your fear of death and you master everything." It was philosophy born from practice, wisdom earned in blood. But Tubman's speeches weren't just about the past. She had lived long enough to see the promise of Reconstruction betrayed. She watched as the Ku Klux Klan rose from the ashes of the Confederacy. She saw voting rights given and then stolen away through violence and legislation. She witnessed the birth of Jim Crow laws that would create a new kind of bondage. And she warned anyone who would listen. The battle wasn't over. "You'll be free or die," she had once told the slaves she led north. Now she was telling all of America the same thing. Freedom wasn't something you achieved once. It was something you fought for every single day. And if you weren't willing to fight for it, you would lose it. The comfortable lies of separate but equal were already taking root, and Moses saw them for what they were, slavery by another name. Her home in Auburn became a pilgrimage site. Young activists would come to sit at her feet, to hear the stories firsthand. She would tell them about the general who didn't believe a woman could plan military operations until she proved him wrong. About the Confederate officer who walked right past her, never suspecting that the washerwoman was memorizing his troop positions. About the night she led 300 souls to freedom while an entire Confederate regiment slept less than a mile away. But she also told them harder truths. About the slaves who wanted to turn back, who preferred the devil they knew to the uncertainty of freedom. About the free blacks in the North who looked down on the newly escaped. About the white abolitionists who fought against slavery but still couldn't see her as an equal. These weren't comfortable stories, but comfort wasn't what the next generation needed. They needed truth. One young visitor asked her how she had managed to succeed when so many had failed. Her answer was characteristically direct. "I had two things going for me. I could always find the North Star, and I could always find people who needed freedom more than they feared death." But then she added something that would echo through the decades. The North Star is still there, and there are still people who need freedom. The question is, who will be the next conductors? She was passing the torch, but she was also issuing a challenge. The Underground Railroad might be history, but the need for people willing to risk everything for justice would never end. In every generation, there would be those who tried to put chains on others, sometimes physical, sometimes legal, sometimes economic. And in every generation, there would need to be those willing to break those chains. March 10, 1913. Harriet Tubman is 90 years old, though she might be 93. Birth records weren't kept for slaves. She lies in the home she built for others, surrounded by the people she saved, the children of the people she saved, and the grandchildren who would carry her story forward. Her body is failing, but her mind is sharp. Sharp enough to know that America is trying to forget her. Sharp enough to know that she can't let that happen. The last years haven't been kind. The seizures come more frequently now. The headaches that have plagued her since that overseer threw the weight at her skull 70 years ago have become constant companions. But pain is an old friend, and Harriet Tubman knows how to function despite it. She has one last mission to complete, ensuring her story survives. She calls for the local newspaper reporter, not the big city journalists who occasionally still come calling, looking for sensational stories about the Black Moses. She wants someone local, someone who will record not just the adventures but the purpose behind them. Because here's what Harriet Tubman understands that many historians don't. History isn't just what happened. It's why it happened, and what it means for tomorrow. They're already trying to make the war about everything except slavery, she tells the reporter. Already trying to make heroes out of the men who fought to keep us in chains. I won't have it. Not while I still have breath. Her voice is weaker now, but the iron will that carried her through swamps and Confederate territory is still there. You write this down. I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if only they knew they were slaves. That last line would become her most famous quote, but in context, it's even more powerful. She's not just talking about physical bondage. She's talking about mental chains, about the ways people imprison themselves with fear, with complacency, with the lie that things can't be changed. She had spent her life proving that lie wrong, and she wanted to make sure future generations knew it. The reporter asks about her regrets. She laughs, a sound like wind through autumn leaves. "Regret is a luxury I never could afford," she says. But then she grows serious. "If I regret anything, it's that I couldn't do more. Every life I saved reminded me of the ones I couldn't reach. Every family I reunited reminded me of the ones still torn apart. The work is never finished. That's what people need to understand. Freedom is never finished." As her strength fades over the following days, people begin to gather. They come from all over New York, from Philadelphia, from Maryland. Former slaves she had led to freedom, soldiers she had served with, children and grandchildren of both. They fill her room with songs, the old spirituals that had been their code, their comfort, their call to courage. "Swing low, sweet chariot" rises through the house, and for a moment, you can almost see her as she was. Young, strong, unstoppable. But even as death approaches, Tubman is teaching. She gathers the young people close. "They'll try to make you forget," she whispers. "They'll try to tell you it wasn't so bad, that it's all in the past, that you should move on. Don't let them. Remember, not for revenge, but for vigilance. Because the moment you forget is the moment they'll try to put the chains back on." On March 10th, she speaks her last recorded words. "I go to prepare a place for you." Biblical to the end, but also practical. She had spent her life preparing places for others. Safe houses on the Underground Railroad, homes for the elderly and indigent, spaces of freedom in a hostile world. Why would death be any different? When the news of her passing spreads, something remarkable happens. The United States government, which had made her wait 34 years for a pension, suddenly remembers her service. She is buried with military honors, the flag draped over her coffin, the same flag she had served even when it didn't fully recognize her humanity, the same flag she had believed in, even when it failed to believe in her. But the real tribute comes from the people. Thousands line the streets of Auburn. Black and white, young and old, they come to say goodbye to Moses. They understand what many in power still don't. This woman hadn't just freed slaves. She had redefined what American courage looked like. The funeral is over. The dignitaries have gone home. The newspaper obituaries have been filed, most of them getting basic facts wrong, many of them diminishing her role to helper rather than leader, assistant rather than strategist. But in homes across America, in churches and meeting halls, in the places where the real work of freedom continues, Harriet Tubman's story is being told correctly, and it's spreading like fire. You want to understand the power of legacy? Look at what happens in the years immediately after Tubman's death. The women's suffrage movement, which she had supported in her final years, adopts her as a symbol. When they march on Washington, they carry her picture. When they're arrested and jailed, they sing the songs she taught them. If Moses could face bloodhounds and bullets, they say, we can face police clubs and prison cells. The early civil rights organizers study her methods. They realize that the Underground Railroad wasn't just about moving bodies from south to north. It was about building networks of trust, creating systems of communication that the oppressor couldn't crack, maintaining discipline under pressure. When they organized the Montgomery bus boycott 40 years after her death, they're using principles Harriet Tubman pioneered. But here's what's extraordinary. Her influence extends beyond the movements you'd expect. Military strategists at West Point begin including her raids in their curriculum, not as footnotes but as case studies in unconventional warfare. The Combahee River raid becomes a textbook example of intelligence-led operations. Special Forces units study how she maintained operational security, how she recruited and managed human intelligence networks, how she achieved tactical surprise against superior forces. During World War II, when the Allies need to build resistance networks, in occupied Europe, guess whose methods they study? The OSS, predecessor to the CIA, creates training materials based on Tubman's techniques. How to move through hostile territory, how to maintain cover identities, how to turn the enemy's assumptions against them. The spy who couldn't read or write had written the book on intelligence operations without putting pen to paper, but the attempts to diminish her continue. Textbooks reduce her to a paragraph, maybe two. They make her story safe, sanitized, stripping away the radical nature of what she did. They turn Moses into a helpful woman who led a few slaves to freedom, carefully omitting that she was a military commander, a spy master, a radical who believed in armed resistance against injustice. Why does this matter? Because every generation needs its Moses. Every generation faces its own forms of bondage, its own systems of oppression, its own moments when someone needs to say, "We're going to be free or die trying." And if you don't know the real story, if you think Harriet Tubman was just a nice lady who helped some people, then you don't understand what's possible. The 1960s arrive, and suddenly Harriet Tubman is everywhere. Freedom riders invoke her name when they board buses in defiance of segregation. When Martin Luther King Jr. speaks of the long arc of the moral universe bending toward justice, he's talking about the arc that Tubman bent with her own hands. When Malcolm X speaks of achieving freedom by any means necessary, he's echoing the woman who carried a pistol on the Underground Railroad. But perhaps her greatest legacy is in the unnamed, uncounted people who hear her story and think, if she could do that, what can I do? The teacher who refuses to let her students be written off as unteachable. The lawyer who takes cases others won't touch. The neighbor who provides sanctuary to those in danger. They might not call themselves conductors, but they're operating on the same principle. When you see injustice, you act. Not tomorrow. Not when it's safe. Now. Because that's what Harriet Tubman really taught us. Not just that freedom is possible, but that freedom is a verb. It's not something you have. It's something you do. Every day, in ways small and large, you either expand freedom or you let it contract. You either stand with the oppressed or you stand aside. There is no neutral ground on the train to freedom. Here we are, more than a century after Harriet Tubman's death, and the question remains, what would Moses do today? What systems would she infiltrate? What networks would she build? What assumptions would she turn into weaknesses? The answer isn't comfortable, because comfort was never her goal. Truth was, freedom was, justice was. Look around. The chains are different now. Mass incarceration, economic bondage, systems designed to look like freedom while functioning like slavery. The bloodhounds have been replaced by algorithms. The overseers wear suits instead of carrying whips. But the need for conductors, for people willing to risk everything to lead others to freedom, that need remains as urgent as ever. You think you would have helped Harriet Tubman? You think you would have been one of the brave ones, the ones who hid fugitives in their basements, who risked their own freedom to expand someone else's? Here's the truth that should keep you up at night. You have that same choice today. Right now, the Underground Railroad is all around you. It just looks different. It looks like the teacher who refuses to give up on the kid everyone else has written off. It looks like the lawyer working pro bono to get someone out of an unjust imprisonment. It looks like the neighbor who speaks up when ICE comes knocking. It looks like the worker who organizes their workplace despite the risk. It looks like anyone who sees injustice and says, "Not on my watch." But here's what Harriet Tubman would want you to understand. Individual acts of courage aren't enough. She didn't just free individuals. She built systems. She created networks. She thought strategically. One person escaping slavery was good. Creating a system that could free hundreds, that could provide intelligence to destroy slavery itself. That was transformation. So the question isn't just, what would Moses do? The question is, what will you do? Because somewhere right now, someone is looking at their own North Star, gathering the courage to run toward freedom. Somewhere right now, a modern overseer is counting on fear to keep people in line. Somewhere right now, the future is being decided by who acts and who remains silent. Harriet Tubman couldn't read, but she could read the stars. She couldn't write, but she wrote history with her footsteps. She couldn't vote, but she voted with her actions every single day. She proved that the most powerful force in human history isn't armies or governments or wealth. It's people who refuse to accept injustice, who refuse to believe that wrong is permanent, who refuse to let fear decide their limits. Remember, every empire built on oppression has believed itself eternal. Every system of bondage has claimed to be the natural order. And every single one has fallen to people like Harriet Tubman, people who saw through the lie, who recognized that what humans built, humans could destroy. Not through violence for its own sake, but through the strategic dismantling of injustice, brick by brick, chain by chain, soul by soul. The Confederate generals who put a bounty on her head have statues in town squares. The men who wrote laws to keep her enslaved are in history books as founding fathers. But whose name do we invoke when we need courage? Whose story do we tell when we need to remind ourselves that impossible is just another word for hasn't been done yet? Moses. Always Moses. She never asked for permission to be great. She never waited for the right moment. She looked at the world as it was, brutal, unjust, seemingly unchangeable, and decided to change it anyway. With no money, no formal education, no official authority, she changed the course of American history. What's your excuse? This is her legacy, and it comes with a challenge. Freedom isn't free, but it's also not for sale. You can't buy it. You can't inherit it. You can't vote for someone else to deliver it. You have to claim it, defend it, expand it. Every generation faces its Egypt. Every generation needs its Moses. The only question is whether you'll follow when they call, or better yet, whether you'll be the one calling others to freedom. The North Star is still there. The need is still there. The trains are still running, they just look different now. Some carry refugees to sanctuary cities. Some carry voters to polls despite suppression efforts. Some carry truth through forests of lies. Some carry hope through deserts of despair. The question Harriet Tubman left us with remains unanswered. Who will be the conductors? She told us the answer before she died. Every great dream begins with a dreamer. Always remember you have within you the strength, the patience, and the passion to reach for the stars to change the world. She reached for the stars and pulled down freedom. She changed the world with nothing but will and wisdom. She proved that one person, fully committed to justice, is more powerful than all the armies of oppression. So here's your mission, should you choose to accept it. Be a conductor on whatever railroad leads to freedom in your time. Build the networks, harbor the fugitives, gather the intelligence, plan the raids, free the captives. And when they tell you it's impossible, remember the 5-foot-tall woman with seizures who made generals look like amateurs, who made the Confederacy tremble, who made freedom more than a word. She made it a reality. The story of Harriet Tubman isn't history. It's prophecy. It's instruction. It's a battle cry for every generation that follows. Because as long as there are people in chains, whether metal or mental, whether legal or economic, there is work to do. And as long as there is work to do, we need people willing to look at the North Star and say what Moses said. I'm going to be free or die trying, and I'm taking as many people with me as I can. This is her story. This is her legacy. This is her challenge to you. The woman who couldn't read left us a book written in courage. The woman who couldn't write left us instructions written in action. The woman they tried to erase from history became eternal. Because you can kill a person, but you can't kill what they represent. You can't kill the idea that freedom is worth everything. You can't kill the proof that one person can change the world. Harriet Tubman is gone. Moses has crossed her final river. But the Underground Railroad is eternal, and it's always looking for conductors. It's looking for you. The question isn't whether you're brave enough. She was terrified too. The question isn't whether you're strong enough. She was 5 feet tall and subject to seizures. The question isn't whether you're smart enough. She couldn't read or write. The question is whether you're willing. Whether you'll answer when freedom calls. Whether you'll be the Moses your generation needs. The North Star is still there. Still pointing the way. Still waiting for the next person with the courage to follow it all the way to freedom. Not just their own, but everyone's. That person could be you. Should be you. Will it be you? Like this video if Harriet Tubman's story moved you. Subscribe to this channel if you believe history's greatest lessons come from its greatest heroes. Share your thoughts below. Does her courage inspire you to act? What chains in your own time need breaking? This channel is for those who believe history is made not only by armies, but by individual courage, by people like Harriet Tubman, by people like you.